Hello, Mr. Weber.
Hello, or good afternoon here, and I guess good evening where you are
Good
in
evening.
Britain.
Thank you for talking to me.
Yes, well, I'm very interested in talking about the failed experiment of the Soviet Union and socialism and so forth. So it's a subject very dear to my heart and also to you. I've been very fascinated by the whole, really, the Soviet experiment particularly. I mean, many countries call themselves socialist, but the Soviet Union claimed it was beginning a new epoch in human history. It claimed to be the beginning of a whole new era of human development, that the 1917 revolution and Bolshevik takeover wasn't just one more change of government or even a revolution. It represented a whole new period in human history, which had been foretold, of course, by Karl Marx. This is fascinating to me because even as a young man, I was very impressed, I guess, even attracted to a theory and an outlook that promises to explain all of human history and to point the way to a better future for all of humanity. That's a very appealing image and a vision for millions of people, and was for a long time. And what's fascinating to me also is that the Soviet experiment, which lasted about 70 years, for a time was enormously influential, very powerful, of course, especially during the Second World War and during the Cold War era when I was a boy. And then it all just fell apart in the late 1980s. At the very end, no one was willing to die for it or fight for it. It wasn't crushed by a foreign country. It just fell apart. It popped like a soap bubble. That's a fascinating thing for me, really. I was very interested when I was a teenager about the great proletarian cultural revolution in China, which also promised to usher in a new era, inspired by the words of Mao Zedong, with the images of Karl Marx, Frederick Engels, Joseph Stalin, Vladimir Lenin, and so forth. And that was a fiasco that went on for 3-4 years before it finally all just fell apart too. And of course, what's happened since then has been an extraordinary story in China. But my point is, many people say to me, Mr. Weber, well, what's the point of even talking about it? It's in the past. It doesn't matter. Who cares? It matters for several reasons, but one of them is that the capacity of people to believe things that are attractive looking, but based upon false pretenses, is a very powerful one, and continues to be a powerful one even in our time. And I think that we're undergoing a period in Western Europe and in the United States today of a crisis of our system. I mean, there's many, many examples I can give. I don't need to spell them out to say there's a kind of crisis of identity, a crisis of confidence in Western Europe, in Britain, and in the United States today. And I think that the understanding the crisis of Western-style democracy, the United States today, can be helped greatly by understanding the rise and fall of the whole Soviet experiment, and also from other examples in history. But I'm glad to be on with you. You asked me to say something about myself. I'm an American historian. I was born and raised in Portland, Oregon. I live now in Southern California. I have traveled extensively, not just in the United States, but also in Europe and in Africa. And I lived for a time in 2.5 years in Germany. I traveled all over much of Europe. I hold a bachelor's degree and a master's degree also in history, with a specialization in modern European history. So that's something of my educational background. And for several decades now, I've been director of a small organization called the Institute for Historical Review here in California. And we try to deal with and talk about things that are happening in the world today from a historical perspective. I mean, to see it in a historical context, and to look at history and chapters of history that are relevant to the times we live in today. And we try to do that through, all sorts of outreach, but most notably through our website. Our main website is ihr.org, and I urge people to take a look at that if they want to know more about what I do and what we do. But again, I'm happy to be on with you because the whole question of the right kind of society, the right kind of social political organization is one that people are debating very, very intensely today. And we see this even in the arguments and debates and so forth that are happening throughout Western Europe and Britain and the United States about America and its past and its future.
Okay. I think I can say something about why nobody actually defended the Soviet Union when it fell. And it didn't happen suddenly. I mean, I was surprised when it happened myself. But looking back, I realized that there was nothing sudden about it. Because it was hollowed from within, it was hollowed for decades. And the more we learn about the Soviet history now, the more we realize that it was hollowed from the beginning, that actually what happened under Gorbachev was the logical conclusion of what started under Lenin. But we understand this only in hindsight. and I'm looking at what's going on in the West these days, and I'm afraid that there are certain parallels. Obviously, the West today is not totalitarian. Obviously, the West today institutionally has nothing to do with the Soviet Union and all that. But I can see how the West is gradually being hollowed from within. Not in the same way, but still, I'm afraid that it may go down the way the Soviet Union went at some point.
Well, when you say that looking in hindsight, the Soviet Union, the fall of the Soviet Union was obvious in hindsight, that's very true, but it was not obvious in foresight. The American CIA didn't foretell the fall of the Soviet Union. In fact, leaders in the United States and other countries assumed the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire was a formidable force and that it would be enduring for a long time. Everyone was, I mean, all the so-called experts were very surprised. There were only a very, very few that foresaw the collapse of the Soviet Union. One person in the Soviet Union himself who wrote about this was a young man named Andrei Amalrik, who wrote a book, well, the Soviet Union survived till 1984. He wrote that in the 70s. And or late 60s, early 70s. And actually, he became a defector. He came to the West, and I heard him speak at Indiana University, where I was a graduate student. And I had already read his booklet, which foretold, in a way, the end of the Soviet Union. And even though he foretold that it would not survive, he was off by a few years. I thought his analysis of why and how it would break apart was actually very poor, and it didn't happen the way he thought. There was one scholar in France, a woman, who also foretold and said that the Soviet Union is actually very weak. What was remarkable is not that so many people did not support the Soviet Union, that it fell apart, as you point out. What's remarkable is that Lenin and Stalin, and even Khrushchev, would have killed people to keep it in place. And the leaders of the Soviet Union, and especially the military leaders, were not willing to kill a whole lot of people, as Lenin and Stalin would have been to hold on to Soviet power. I think that's the decisive thing. As you know, there was a coup, an attempt by people trying to hold on to the Soviet system against Mikhail Gorbachev, and he was held captive for a while. And it came down to this. Yeltsin mobilized some popular support in Moscow, and it came down to a decision by the military commander in Moscow. And he refused to follow the leaders of the coup and shoot on the public to hold on to the remnants, you might say, of Soviet power. And that was the decisive thing. When people in the regime is no longer willing to shoot large numbers of people, to brutally hold on to power, then its power is really lost. A similar thing happened in Eastern Europe. None of this regime set up by the Soviet Union after World War II in Hungary or in East Germany or in Czechoslovakia were willing to hold on to power with the ruthlessness that Lenin and Stalin had shown when they were in power. That was really decisive. It was very clear, as you say, especially in hindsight, how weak, how fraudulent really the whole Soviet edifice was. I mean, already for years, people in the Soviet Union, and I think you can confirm this, and also in Eastern Europe, had stopped believing the slogans. Nobody really believed anymore that with a few more years, the great communist utopia would be realized. Something that Nikita Khrushchev, had predicted in the 60s. He said, people still alive will live under communism, not just socialism, but communism, when there'll be really real equality. Of course, people had stopped believing that completely by the 70s, and by the 80s, no one really believed these slogans anymore. And something similar is happening in Western Europe and in Britain and the United States today. We hear all sorts of slogans, but in fact, the leaders themselves, I don't even think, believe the very slogans that they mouth now in the United States, in Western Europe, and of course Britain, France, Germany, and so forth. But they still hold on to this kind of idea of what should be. And what we're really seeing, I think, in Western Europe and the United States is the end of what I call the post-war era. It's the era that was established, the structure that was established by the victors of the Second World War. The Soviet Union, of course, controlled Eastern Europe and set up its form of government in Eastern Europe, and the United States insisted on setting up its form of society in Western Europe and part of the rest of the world as well.
Well, we differ on some of these points, if I may. So to start with, CIA was always wrong. I mean, there is a big book written on the subject, The History of Ashes, which demonstrates that CIA was always wrong. Not usually, always.
I won't disagree. I mean, the CIA completely was unable to foresee the fall of the Shah in Iran in 1979.
No, not just that. I mean, CIA probably has done more harm than good when it came to fighting socialism.
Okay.
Because a case could be made that the West would have been stronger and the Soviet Union would have been weaker if the CIA never existed.
Well,
but I will not digress going into what's in that book. I want to talk about other things.
Okay.
About predicting, actually, there were even more people who predicted it. For example, there was a Russian, a Soviet emigre. His name escapes me. He wrote the book Zapadnya. Zapadnya in English would be a trap. So he described socialism as a trap into which nations fall and cannot get out, which is very accurate. And he even prophetically at the end of the book wrote that he wrote it somewhere in the 70s again, that it is likely that eventually there will be a reformer who will come in Kremlin, who will try to save the system and will only accelerate its downfall. And of course, there was Zhelev, who is totally unknown in the West, probably because he has never been published in English. And he very accurately predicted in his book on the totalitarianism, which he had to name fascism, because obviously under socialism he couldn't possibly write an honest book about socialism. So he pretended he's writing a book about Nazi Germany and fascist Italy and all that. But it was obvious when you read, for all those who read the book, that it was about the Soviet socialism. And of course, by the way, the state security was not fooled for long. They destroyed most of the total print, but some copies survived and were in circulation. And he wrote that if somebody tries to make a totalitarian regime democratic and liberal and all that, this could have only one conclusion: the downfall of the regime. That no other possible outcomes are feasible, and this is something to remember, because the Western so-called experts were arguing even during the Gorbachev's perestroika, will Gorbachev succeed? And Zhelev wrote even before Gorbachev came to power, this could not possibly succeed. It's totally out of the question. It's impossible. Now, about the Soviet Union being formidable, I differ here on you. Actually, it was formidable. It was simultaneously, this is not so easy to grasp. It was simultaneously brittle and formidable. And this was not a new thing. This was not something that happened under Gorbachev. It was demonstrated in 1941 under Stalin, the strongest totalitarian leader of them all. When the Soviet Union virtually disintegrated, began to disintegrate when the Germans invaded. Mm-hmm. To this day, people don't realize that the Germans were not these great warriors who were unstoppable and all that. Actually, their army was relatively small and poorly armed compared to the Red Army. But in 1941, almost all of the Red Army either deserted or surrendered to the Germans because they were hoping to fight their own government. And not only the army, the whole state government apparatus in the western part of the Soviet Union actually disintegrated. I say that socialism fell twice, once in 1991, but the first time was in 1941. And not only the Balts and the Ukrainians, who obviously had no reason to love the Soviet regime. The Soviet government was disintegrating even in the parts which were populated by Russians. This reached even Moscow. The Soviet propaganda called it panic.
Yes.
But
yes, I'm aware of this, and I think this needs to be really better understood. Because during this,
actually, there are books written on the subject, very exhaustive studies, but unfortunately, again, they're only published in Russian, and it turns out it's very complicated to translate something in English and to get it published over here in English.
Well, you of course, I defer to you. You're much more familiar with the books in Russian. I've tried to follow very well the scholarship in English and also to some extent in Western European languages. But there is more on this subject. There have been many more books. There's some very interesting books published by Scandinavian writers about how even Russian people within the Soviet Union preferred life under German occupation and under Stalin.
No doubt about that. No doubt about that.
But I want to stress, and this is something I think that is very important.
Actually, excuse me if I may interrupt you. Not only that, actually, new studies of the subject show that as murderous as the German occupation was, the death rates under German occupation, despite the mass murder, despite the incredible barbarity and the brutality that the Germans exhibited in Russia, still the death rate was far lower than the death rate in the parts that were never occupied by the Germans. More people died per capita in the parts of the Soviet Union that were never occupied. This is the weird thing.
Yeah, these are very good points, and I think we should agree on one important point. You and I will understand or agree on some points that are very startling, I think, to the general public. I think it's important to understand there is this enormous gap, not between you and me, or between even specialists who try to follow, especially more recent scholarship, even from Russia itself, but an enormous gap between what specialists, what anybody who looks into this subject knows on the one hand, and the image still that's propagated in Hollywood, in motion pictures and so forth in the United States. This is something I think I'm more familiar with than you because I was raised in this. There's still this very, very wide assumption or view of the Second World War and of the Soviet Union that's completely ungrounded, that's very, very divorced from the reality. That's one point I want to make, and that this gap is a tremendous one in our history of the 20th century, as presented in Western Europe, but especially, of course, where in the United States. A second point I wanted to ask and bring up with you is yes, when the Germans came in, not just Germans, but also Finns, Hungarians, Romanians, and other people, many people were so unhappy, so disgusted with the whole Soviet regime for reasons that, of course, we know, that they were much, because the Germans offered many things that the Soviets didn't. But the point is, there's a debate going on. To what extent was America?
They were flocking. The many civilians were flocking to the German army, trying to enlist.
Yes.
Within the Soviet Union. Hitler was met as a liberator initially.
Yes, I know about this because, Solzhenitsyn wrote that never in the history of the world have so many citizens of a country supported the enemy of the country as was true of the Soviet Union in World War II. It's when the Germans finally decided to set up Ukrainian SS divisions, they had many more times the volunteers than they were even asking for. So many people were willing to volunteer to fight against the Soviet Union and Stalin. This is an incredible thing that is very little understood, I think, in the West. But the other point I wanted to talk with you about is the debate that's going on by some people over the question of to what extent was the Soviet Union saved by the United States? The biggest supporter of the Soviet Union outside of the Soviet Union itself was Franklin Roosevelt and the United States. As you know, even before the United States was formally in the war, after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December, Franklin Roosevelt was pledging military aid to the Soviet Union, even though the United States officially was a neutral country. And of course, American aid to the Soviet Union was very extensive during the Second World War. But I don't have a final answer about it, but historians disagree.
Yeah, it's actually very hard to answer this because there are so many factors at play with this aid.
I agree.
It's a very long conversation.
Okay, well, I just wanted to know if you had a short answer. I don't have a short answer myself.
I don't have an answer, but Solonin, Mark Solonin seems to have an answer. He made the case that most of all, the Soviet Union was saved by two people, Hitler and Stalin. So this requires, of course, he also makes the case that the American aid helped greatly. And although not for the reasons that are usually assumed by the Westerners assume that the Soviets didn't have arms and America gave them arms to fight. Actually, the American arms were a small percentage and very often of inferior quality. So, for example, with the tanks, it was 10% of the tanks.
Yes.
And the American Shermans were clearly not equal to the Soviet T-34s. But in three respects, the American aid was actually very important. Food, fuel additives, and aluminum.
Yes, I was going to say aluminum was very important, and trucks also were important.
Yes, trucks. The trucks were not so critical. They helped greatly. They mattered. But these three things, the food and the additives, because without these three things, The Soviet Union couldn't have manufactured so many airplanes. They lost almost all of their aluminum production facilities because they were near the border. Even without the American aid in terms of food, so many Soviet soldiers were starving to death. So many more would have starved, obviously. And as for the additives, I don't remember on the top of my head, but a very large percentage of the aviation gasoline, that aviation, sorry, the word escapes me. Benzene, it's in Russian. Gas, the gas that the piston engines in the airplanes use. Sorry, what's the word?
I don't know what the word, but that's not the main point. The main point,
yeah, that's not the main point. Here's the main point. I digress. The main point is what was the crucial moment when Germany lost the war, and who actually saved the Soviet Union? So Solonin makes the case that it was Hitler and Stalin. Why Hitler? Because Hitler, contrary to popular opinion, obviously people always assume that that was the biggest mistake to invade the Soviet Union and all. Actually, that was a very sensible decision. One of the few sensible decisions Hitler made. Maybe the best decision in his career, because it turns out he was incredibly lucky. Instead of Germany being defeated within months, Germany could fight for years. And not only that, Germany had a golden opportunity because the Soviet people hated the Soviet government and they were willing actually to fight on the side of the Germans. And the Soviet regime had no chance. And many of the German officers, high-ranking officers, saw this golden opportunity and they approached Hitler. And at this point, Hitler did the biggest mistake in his career, probably the most stupid thing he could have done. He forbade them to enlist Soviet soldiers. He said something like this, according to the memoirs of one German general. The English have their Negroes in Africa, and we will have our Negroes in Russia. The Russians will be our Negroes, something like this. So instead of using this golden opportunity, actually to defeat the Soviet Union with the hands of the Soviet people, and actually to have after this a very powerful ally that could have allowed him to win the war, he ruined his chances of ever winning this war, because strategically Germany had no chance on its own, obviously. And Stalin was the second one, with his infamous order 270, I forgot the number, 77, or I quote it in my book, but the number escapes me, where he, among other things, ordered that the families of the soldiers who were taken prisoner are not given rations in the rear, which at the time meant that they will starve. So meanwhile, the Germans were imprisoning the Soviet prisoners of war in inhumane conditions, in camps in the open, not feeding them well, and a great number of them died needlessly from exposure and maltreatment and starvation and all that. So the Soviet soldiers were faced with the following dilemma. If they fought for Stalin, there was a big chance that they will die, but at least their families in the rear will survive, will have a chance of surviving. On the other hand, if they surrender to the Germans, first, they will die, and second, their families will die. And so the Soviet soldiers were rational. Humans react to incentives, and they were incentivized by Hitler and Stalin actually to fight the Germans. Mm-hmm. This is how Germany lost the war. This was the most crucial decision Hitler ever made in this war. It was not whether to go for Kiev or to go for Moscow or to attack in June or to attack, because obviously all these arguments, you're familiar with them. If only Hitler didn't waste time defeating Greece and Yugoslavia, if only he invaded earlier. Actually, it turns out if he invaded earlier, it would have been even worse for Germany, because it turns out Hitler invaded in the moment, by chance, in the very moment when the Red Army was most vulnerable, when it was preparing to invade Germany, when much of it was Suvorov and Solonin and others have made this, and Sokolov and others have made this case, when the shells could be miles away, and the personnel could be here, and the guns could be many miles away in another direction, and the staff in a fourth place. So it was the worst possible moment for the Red Army when the Germans invaded, and this led to this chaos, which eventually gave the opportunity of the Soviet citizens to rise against their government. But Hitler blew his only chance to win in this war. So Stalin and Hitler were the main players in this. Roosevelt helped the Soviet Union, but remember, as much as Roosevelt helped, most of the help came in 1943 and 1944, when the most critical moment was over. The most critical moment was 1941, when the Soviet armies were just melting. They were either deserting or surrendering. They didn't want to fight. That was the problem Stalin faced. So Stalin had 10 times more tanks than the Germans, for example. And the Soviet tanks were way superior to the German ones. But the vast majority of these 30,000 tanks never fired a shot in anger. They were just left by the road, abandoned by their crews. And the same went for airplanes and for howitzers and all that.
Okay. Well, these are all very good topics. Yes, I agree with you. There's no final answer to some of these questions. How decisive was American aid? At what point did the Germans lose the war? There's other points that can be brought up in that. But we have a larger discussion, really, about social political systems. And talking about the Second World War is important. And of course, I'm very interested in it. There's quite a lot on our website about that. In fact, on our website is an article by a Russian writer about the whole question of prisoners of war, and making the point in detail that you do. And other writers have been writing about this as well. The tremendous, you might say, inhumanity of Stalin's view that any Soviet soldier who surrendered was considered a traitor. This is an extraordinary thing, really.
Well, actually, weirdly, Stalin was not paranoid here. He was correct from the point of view of his regime. They were traitors to his government. Yeah, that's correct. They were not traitors to Russia or to Ukraine, but they were definitely traitors to the Soviet Union.
Right. Well, that even brings up something more extraordinary that I think anyone who is familiar with the history of the Soviet Union, and particularly of Stalin, is struck by. And that is this, that the Soviet regime was never even saw itself as a legitimate regime. Even the leaders of the Soviet Union saw, and Stalin saw himself as a kind of band of criminals who had taken over a country. There wasn't
they were a band of criminals.
But literally. The incredible thing is that he even understood that there was this immense distrust of the people, and even within the regime, of each other. That's an extraordinary thing to me. How regime
actually there is nothing extraordinary. They knew very well that they were insiders. It may sound extraordinary to you, but they were living there. They had built this regime, so they knew very well what this regime is based on, and it was based on terror and nothing else.
But see, that to me, for a person outside of Russia, for a person in Western Europe or the United States, it's hard to understand how a regime can have no real foundation in its own people to that extent. That's an extraordinary thing. It's like a group of mafiosa criminals take over a country or something. It's hard to understand how any government can persist in power, can continue in power without some sort of normal mandate from its population. That's an extraordinary thing for, at least in Western Europe and the United States, for people to understand.
Well, the Soviet Union was, from its inception, they came to power using violence, and they held power using violence. And the moment they turned the volume down on the violence, the Soviet Union began to disintegrate.
Yes. No,
that's all there is to it.
I mean, I agree with you. It's very hard for people outside to understand that. I agree with you. And in fact, in the whole Soviet narration of its own history was that the Bolsheviks had taken power in what they called the Great October Revolution. It wasn't a revolution.
Which never happened.
It wasn't a revolution. It was a coup.
Wasn't a revolution.
It was a very small number of people taking power in Moscow and Petrograd or Petersburg, and then holding on to power ruthlessly. They never had anything like a real mandate from the population. All they had for a time in 1917 was a majority in the Soviet councils in Moscow and Petrograd. But the vast majority of people in Russia were peasants. And overwhelmingly, of course, they had a very strong contempt for all that the Soviet Union, even the communists, represented. But my only point is, the point you're making and the point that history shows, it's very difficult, I think, for people outside to understand how a regime can even hold power without any kind of real mandate from its own people, that it was as brittle as it was. And especially as an American, during the Second World War, Stalin was portrayed in the American media and by Roosevelt and by the American politicians as
and by Hollywood.
And by Hollywood as a genuinely popular man. It's an extraordinary distortion of reality.
Actually, there is a Hollywood movie. I don't remember the title. I think it was A Mission to Moscow. By the way, it was based on the memoirs of the American ambassador.
Yeah.
Where the public trials are portrayed as though they are trials taking place in an Anglo-Saxon courtroom.
Yes. Yes.
And these people are really guilty, and nobody is beating them up, nobody is dragging them, nobody is threatening their loved ones. No, they simply confess because it's the truth, because they're guilty. Right. And that movie was based on a best-selling book, and that movie was even nominated for some award. I don't remember. It was not an obscure movie.
Yes, of course. I've read the book many times. It was a big bestseller. It's the diary of Joseph Davies, who was a complete incompetent, a fool, really, who was made ambassador by Roosevelt to Moscow.
But the interesting thing is not how incompetent he was. The interesting thing is that Hollywood always does. I'm looking at it from a sociological point of view. Hollywood always does. Tries to adhere to the tastes, to the prevailing expectations of the public. And apparently the American public wanted to see things in this way, because otherwise they would have never made this movie. They want to make money.
They wanted to see it. The American public wanted to see it that way because the Soviet Union was an ally. It was more, and we know this from the internal documents and so forth, the movie was made because it was in line with what the Roosevelt administration wanted. The Roosevelt administration pushed for this movie. That's really what was decisive. The director of the movie is the same director, Cortez, that did Casablanca, for example. The leading actor in Mission to Moscow was Walter Houston, who was a very famous American actor. And he also was the narrator for the official U.S. propaganda motion picture series called Why We Fight. He was a very, very prominent actor. But as you say, one of the most striking scenes is the show trial of Bukharin, in which Bukharin is portrayed as this kind of intellectual who just freely confesses to the most extraordinarily bogus crimes. And even at the time, George Kennan was at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow at the time, and he was just appalled at the stupidity or ignorance of Joseph Davies, who at the time accepted this fraud, this charade of a trial that Stalin had put on. I mean, again, Mission to Moscow had an enormous influence, not only because he was an ambassador and was made into a Hollywood movie, but it was backed up by the administration. And this is one of the key aspects of the Second World War, is the enormous misrepresentation of the world situation by the American government, by Franklin Roosevelt, who portrayed and seemed to believe, both privately and publicly, that Stalin was this trustworthy man in building a whole new world order after the war, that the United States and the Soviet Union would be partners in this new world. This is already an extraordinary thing because it is so contrary to the reality, and of course, very, very difficult for Americans to grasp how a president could be this self-delusional as Franklin Roosevelt was.
Yeah, but how? There is something very murky about Roosevelt. I don't know. I'm not familiar with this subject. I don't want to go there because I find it hard to imagine that it was just delusional. There is something more there that maybe we don't know. Maybe Stalin had something against him. I don't know. Because it's just too much to believe that he could be that stupid. I cannot explain it with sheer stupidity. But sorry.
It's not just stupidity, it's wishful thinking. And this gets us to the present. Very much the leaders in America today, in my view, are guilty of a similar kind of self-delusional thinking. They believe things will happen a certain way because they should happen a certain way. This is the appeal of communism. They want to believe in a kind of egalitarianism, an egalitarian future for America and the world that's not based on the reality of human beings. It's not based on the reality of history. And this ability to delude ourselves is one that's very much at play in America today, I think. American leaders of both parties have been pushing for policies of what they call equity, not just equal opportunity, but equal outcome. And these policies have been supported not only by the mass media, but by the political leaders of both the Republican and the Democratic Party for more than 50 years in the United States. This idea of we have to artificially try to create a kind of equal outcome or equity among all the groups and peoples in the United States is a delusion. It's a fiction, but it sounds good. And it sounds good in the way that for many people, communism sounds good. Well, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a society in which from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs, the slogan, of course, of the Communist Manifesto. And Americans, many people around the world think, it sounds so good. Why can't we create a society like that? And that kind of thinking is still very, very prominent in America today, and is much of the reason why we have the crisis in our country, because the reality is very different.
There is a pattern with all these, just like there is a pattern with every fraud. There is a pattern with every social engineering project and a pattern with every social engineering ideology. And when you begin to read about the history of socialism, the history of national socialism, the history of foreign aid, the history of feminism, the history of wokeism, the history of environmentalism, you begin to see that there are a lot of similarities.
Yes, and this is the point. I want to bring this to the present. The importance of understanding history and reality, understanding the pattern of human beings over time, because human nature does not change. Human beings are still human beings.
Yes, but there is one thing. It looks like all these disastrous projects, social engineering projects from the socialism to the wokeism for the last 100 years are way more prevalent in our times than they used to be 200 years ago or 300 years ago.
Yes.
So when
yes.
people, my hypothesis would be that it's connected with the religion, because the religion teaches humility, teaches people actually to be not to be so arrogant as to think that they know how to fix the world, because nobody knows how to fix the world.
Mm-hmm.
All those who try to fix the world always made it worse. Nobody ever succeeds to fix the world. I remember watching a documentary on Afghanistan, and there was an interview with one of those mujahideen who has fought the Soviets at the time. And he said something very simple, which you could expect to hear from him, and yet it explains a lot. He said, God has made people to be rich and to be poor. God has decided that the world should be in this way. So who are the communists to decide otherwise, to decide to change it? And this is the moderating factor of religion.
Mm-hmm.
It is crucial. And the moment we lost this, we became too arrogant, because behind all these projects, all these social engineering projects, there is always a bunch of useful idiots who believe that they know how to fix the world.
Yes, this is a very good point you're making. This idea that we are not only smarter, better educated, more insightful than our parents and our grandparents and other people, but we're morally superior to them.
Yes,
this is a very great arrogance, and a very dangerous one. I
remember my grandmother in her youth in the Kingdom of Bulgaria, before the communists came to Bulgaria. She has been a member of the local some communist organization, RAMS. I don't know how to translate this into English. Not the Communist Party, but some branch youth club associated with the Communist Party. And I confronted her many times while she was alive. How could you? I mean, you must have known what's going on in the Soviet Union, and you must have known that if this comes to Bulgaria, the same thing will happen here. And it did happen, by the way. Rommel gives a number of 220,000 people exterminated, Bulgarians exterminated after the communist takeover in 1945, which is an incredible number for a small country of several million people. And she was annoyed by what I was saying. She kept saying, but it was never about that. For us, it was being progressive. By the way, they use this word.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Progressive, being trying to make the world a better place. And also, this is where the young people were. This is where she met my grandfather, who was also one of these leftists, although he was an anarchist. A bit different, but they were more or less together at the time, which is weird, but never mind that. So the useful idiots, for them, it's just a feel-good activity. Mm-hmm. It's like a hobby. This idealism, this shouting in the street, this writing of, they didn't have social media at the time. They were writing things on paper and sometimes printing them and spreading them and all that. And I see this in the West today. And I'm frustrated because I can see that history repeats itself. There are useful idiots in the West today, young people who believe that they will make the world a better place. And they will bring a disaster to the West. It's because it all looks like a freak show now, like a comedy, but there comes a point when the comedy is over and the tragedy begins. Mm-hmm. Or to put it in another way, when the romantic period is over and the porn begins. I mean, I remember one of my law professors at the University of Sofia during a lecture said something along those lines, because he was a former lawyer, and he said the law, when you study the law is like a romantic story, like a chick novel. But when you begin to practice it, you see that it's more like a porn movie. And this is applicable to all these social engineering projects, because they are always very enticing and very pretty at the stage when it's at the idealistic stage, when they're making it work in their own heads, own little heads. And it is when all this bullshit begins to be implemented on the ground that the tragedy begins.
I want to put this in the American context. This is particularly a problem in America because America plays such an important role in the world, not only culturally, economically, but also militarily. And we've seen the expression of this kind of delusional idealism repeatedly in American military policy. When America went into invaded Iraq in 2003, or invaded and took over Afghanistan in 2000, I forget what year it was now, 2002, I guess, the year before, and has taken over other countries. Every time America does that, our leaders tell us, we're going to bring progress to the people there. We're going to make life better. Women will be able to vote. We'll create equality for all sorts of people. And of course, it's time and time again, it proves to be a disaster. But this is a very strong motivating feature of American military action overseas, because Americans like to think that what distinguishes the United States is it's a better country. It's the model for the world. We are better. And this is a very, very strong theme of American leaders for many, many years. Ronald Reagan would say this over and over. America, he said, is like a shining city on the hill. What we do is better because we're Americans. We are, and you'll hear politicians of both parties say over and over, the greatest country that ever existed. The problem is that when America goes overseas and tries to make over societies and it fails, Americans don't care, because the wars that we are involved in are far away from our borders. This is something I learned at an early age in Europe. Europeans, and also in Asia, have a very different sense of what war means than Americans, because Americans have not experienced the horror of war personally in the way that Europeans have had. We haven't had bombs fall on our cities or foreign troops.
Just like us, the East Europeans, we had a different sense of socialism.
Right.
Because we lived under it.
And Americans don't have the same sense of war. When I was a boy, I heard many people would say things like, oh, well, if the Russians cause any trouble, we'll just drop atomic bombs on Moscow. We'll just kill them. Or if the Vietnamese don't do what we want, we'll just level their country. As they'd say, turn it into a parking lot. People would say like this. People talk very, very freely in America about the consequences of war because we don't experience war in the same way. And one thing I learned at a very early age in Europe is that whether people call themselves liberal or conservative, especially on the continent of Europe, there's an enormous fear of another war. People know and remember what the war was like. World War II was a terrible, terrible thing all over Europe. But we don't get that sense in America. America was the one country that during the war, the economy was better. People were better off, even during the war. The war didn't mean privation and it meant rationing, but on a very limited basis. And after the war, America came out of the war as the one country that hadn't been destroyed. So we were on top of the world. And our leaders today, and I mean by that people like Biden and Trump, and people of that generation, or even my generation, they think that American preeminence in the world in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and so forth is the norm. That's the way it should be. America should be the great country. We're the top dog.
And in fact, the Trump campaign slogan is "Make America Great Again." And what he means by that, in part, is that during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, we were tops. America was number one. Well, it's not going back to that, because the American preeminence, in many ways, from the end of World War II up until about 1980, was artificial. It was artificial because the rest of the world was still recovering from the war. Japan had been destroyed. China was destroyed. Europe was in ruins. Russia, of course, was in ruins. Now the rest, anybody traveling around the world knows the world's built up. America products don't compete like they used to. And many Americans want to somehow go back to those days. You hear this from people who both liberal and conservative. Many liberals want to go back to the days of Kennedy, when Kennedy was the kind of model. America was number one. The economy was doing very well. There was much less division, social division, racial, political division within society. And of course, Republicans, they want to go back to a kind of golden age themselves. It's not going back to that. You know, part of the reason for this terrible thing is this kind of hubris about America, because of the enormous advantage America has always had of being far away, protected by oceans, in a country with tremendous resources, in a way that other countries do not have that luxury, do not have that advantage. And that's one of the reasons why these slogans about, oh, we'll make Iraq a country like New England, we'll make Afghanistan a kind of modern American-style country. People say these things because of this kind of hubris that comes from our own history and our own experience. And this is, now it's breaking down tremendously, because in the last 20 years or so, Americans are more and more unhappy. They don't know what went wrong. Something obviously has gone wrong, because as shown by public opinion polls and what you can anecdotally, people are very unhappy with what they see now in America. They look around American cities and they look ugly. There's homelessness all over. Americans are not as confident by any means as they used to be. It's more difficult for young people to save money. And anyway, all of those are expressions of this kind of crisis that America's in today. And I'm getting back to this because it goes to your point about the importance of being realistic about the world, about human nature, about history, about society, about our world. And that's very difficult for Americans to grasp, because we've had such an exceptionally good run for many, many years, and many Americans want to sort of go back to that.
Well, if we depend on the people being realistic, we are lost, because people have never been realistic and they don't want to be realistic, and I don't think that they will ever be realistic. Being realistic means being miserable. It's not. No, seriously, it doesn't bring any happiness. Why would anybody want this? People want to have fun. People want to be part of a community. For example, they especially people who don't have families, and the West is full of them.
Yes,
only
true.
People, and who is giving them a community? Well, the left are giving them a community.
Of a sort, of a kind. Yes,
yes,
of course.
And obviously, to belong to a community, you have to repeat, to share the views of this community. Otherwise, you will be ostracized. So if we are waiting and hoping that people will become realistic, we will be hoping forever. This is not going to happen. By the way, well, in many of his interviews, Thomas Sowell, you could feel his bitterness when he says things like, in politics, reality doesn't matter, it's the perception that matters. And you could see his bitterness that he has been repeating things for decades, and it makes no difference.
I understand, and I appreciate the point.
The case for many things has been made. For example, recently in Scotland, we have these rent controls, which will harm not only the landlords, they will harm those who rent. And this has been known for forever. the experiment has been done in the United States, has been done in Europe, has been done in the third world. Every time the result is the same. Actually, many of these price controls, they go as far back as the Roman Empire, and the result is always the same.
Well,
so my point is, realism will never happen.
Well, I understand your point, but well, a wise person once said, it's possible to ignore reality, but it's not possible to ignore the consequences of reality. People want to ignore reality, and they can do that for a long time. But increasingly, it's very difficult to ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. That's happening now.
I'm sorry.
And Americans are not, huh? What?
Sorry, I wouldn't agree with this wise person, because there are so many examples when reality supposedly asserted itself. History of socialism, for example, gave a heavy dose of reality, because it started with high-minded ideas, went through a horrible extermination of many people, terror, and it ended up in corruption and what we see today in places like Russia. But it doesn't matter, because the whole idea of socialism, like you pointed out, was just repackaged. So superficially, it's a bit different. These days, it's not the working class. These days, it's some minorities, whatever. But again, the same Marxism is there.
Okay, I'm going to give two examples of how reality does matter. First, the Soviet Union finally fell apart. That was a reality. The consequences of the reality of the Soviet Union finally became too much, and the whole thing fell apart. It didn't just go on forever.
Okay, but
that's reality intruding into life. I mean, the reality of the failure of the Soviet Union couldn't be ignored forever, and finally the whole thing fell apart. That's one example.
Actually, it is ignored right now. It is ignored because people believe that what was in the Soviet Union was not true socialism, but when they do it, they will do it better.
Okay.
So
okay.
Some people believe
that
socialism was somehow untainted. Untainted, is this the word?
Okay.
Somehow still pristine in their minds.
Okay. Okay. Some people may say that, but the fact is, the old Soviet system is gone now. It's not there anymore. It's
but
gone.
The socialist idea is not.
For many people, that's true.
Reality doesn't assert itself.
Well, there's a big difference between Russia today and the old Soviet Union. A big difference.
But this is not the point. The point is that socialism, or ideas that resemble socialism,
I grant
are still popular.
I grant that there's still some appeal for that. Okay, the second example is from China. China went through, as I said earlier, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution of 1966 to 1969. It was a fiasco. It was a disaster. Mao organized this thing to try to shake up the system, to keep the revolutionary spirit alive, and it was a very destructive thing. And out of that...
But please note, it was not a disaster for him.
Okay.
He consolidated his power. It was a disaster for the people.
But it lasted only a few years, and after that, really, the Chinese government, everyone turned their back on the whole Marxist model. China then, from the 1980s up to the present, saw the greatest increase in wealth and prosperity for the greatest number of people in all of human history. Millions, hundreds of millions of people were raised from poverty to at least comfortable and even middle class and even rich standards. That's an extraordinary thing in history, and that happened in China. China today is the #1 manufacturing country in the world, the #1 trading country in the world, and very soon will be, if not already, the #1 economic power in the world. That's an extraordinarily different change. That's a great change, an extraordinary difference from the old Soviet system.
China learned from history, but the West didn't.
My point is that reality does change. People don't just continue forever to stay. And something similar is happening in America. I mentioned earlier the booklet that will the Soviet Union survive till 1984. I think it's a good question to say, will the United States survive till the year 2040? A very popular movie that just came out a few months ago is called Civil War in the United States. And increasingly, Americans are adjusting themselves to the idea that the American experiment is failing. Something is very wrong. And whether people talk about it in terms of secession, whether they talk about it in terms of civil war, this is now much more in the mood because people can see it's not working out. Never before, except maybe just before the American Civil War, has American society been as divided and as distrusting of each other as Americans are today. And that's an extraordinary thing. And it has, of course, enormous consequences, not only for the United States, but for the world because of the role the United States has played for so many years. Anyway, those are two examples of reality kicking in the door of history and making things did change. They changed in Russia. The old Soviet Union is gone. Bulgaria is not a socialist state. The Soviet troops are gone. East Germany is now part of Germany. Those are big, important changes. And people thought in the 1970s that the Soviet experiment and communism was on the march all over the world, not only in Europe, but in Asia and Africa, that communism was on the march. I remember when I was in my 30s or 20s or so, people were thinking, oh, you see, Ethiopia is becoming communist, Nicaragua is becoming communist, the communists almost took power in Chile. It's on the march. And it was only 10 years later, the whole thing had failed. And those are big changes. Those are enormous changes. Yes, it's true that some people are still impressed and attracted by this ideal, but not in the way that they were in the 1970s or 80s or 60s, certainly in the 60s. I'm astonished too, just how appealing this is. Just the other week, there was a demonstration of hundreds of people in Philadelphia waving red hammer and sickle flags of a group called themselves the Revolutionary Communists of America. I thought, this is incredible. They're upholding the slogans of a regime that didn't just end, it died. It just perished, really. And you'd think people would learn from that. But no, there's still an attractiveness among many people for this. And you see this kind of rhetoric even among leading politicians, especially of the Democratic Party, but even of many Republicans. But yes, I can understand your pessimism, and I understand Thomas Sowell's disappointment and bitterness that people didn't pay more attention to what he had to say. But nonetheless, things are changing. And as I say, reality has a way of intruding on life.
The last time I went to vote here in Britain, on the ballot there was a party which symbol was hammer and sickle. Okay. I never imagined I would see this symbol after socialism fell in the People's Republic of Bulgaria.
Well, there you go. There you go.
And I'm smiling, but you have no idea how actually I hate this symbol and everything associated with it.
I understand that. I was astonished that a communist was elected the mayor of either Graz or Klagenfurt in Vienna, in Austria. That's a fairly conservative part of Austria. But a communist was elected there. But even more than that, it's remarkable how this wokeism is become very accepted in America. It's become very almost impossible to express opposition to this kind of delusional egalitarianism that you find that's hammered away in the media and so forth here in the United States, and also in Western Europe too. To the point, whereas on the continent, in fact, in Germany, the German government is talking about banning the party, the Alternative für Deutschland party, AfD, even though it's by some polls either the first or second most popular party in Germany. In the name of democracy, they're going to suppress a very popular political party.
Yeah, there They will suppress democracy in the name of democracy.
That's right. That's right. So, and Lenin would have understood this completely. Lenin would have understood.
Yes, because Lenin, by the way, was claiming that the Soviet Union is a democratic country.
Of course, of course. My point is that this is a crisis, though, that you see across Western Europe today. In France, the single most popular party is the Rassemblement National of Marine Le Pen, which is a party that the media calls a fascist party. And the Macron party has something like 15% of the popular support. Well, and they're talking now, oh, we can't allow those undemocratic parties to come to power. Well, I thought democracy means they can come to power if the people support them. Anyway, my point is this is a crisis, and a crisis that was not foreseen 20 years ago or 30 years ago in Europe and the United States.
By the way, something I want to mention, there is this myth that comes from the time of the, I don't know, the perestroika, or maybe that something like 20 million people have been exterminated in the Soviet Union. This myth has been debunked a long time ago, but it persists. The Soviet Union itself admitted of 43 million people exterminated.
Well,
that was an admission made by the last KGB chairman, Khrushchev, made on the Soviet television. But even this number is probably low, because scholars who have dedicated their careers to studying the problem, like Professor Rudolf Rummel, who is the authority on genocide, he comes with a figure in the region of 62 million people. So it's nowhere near 20 million.
Well, I'm familiar with Rummel's book. I think that there's a great deal of gray area or ambiguity about these figures.
He himself points out that his method actually allows for an error that is up to 30%.
Yes.
So the 62 million could be 40 million, well, as Khrushchev admitted, but they could equally be as high as 90 million.
Well, I'm very skeptical. For example, people will count as victims of communism people who died of in the great collectivization of the 1930s.
They should be counted.
Well, they're not dying as directive. The intention wasn't to kill. The intention.
Oh, I'm sorry. I beg to disagree. Actually,
okay.
The intention was to kill, and there is ample evidence that the 7 or so million Ukrainians, mostly, some Russians and some Kazakhs, but mostly Ukrainians, were intentionally starved to death in 1933.
Well, okay. I mean, I know that there's a debate, and I know many Ukrainians who insist that it was deliberately done to kill.
No, it's not. Never mind what the Ukrainians claim. There have been many Western, serious, credible Western scholars like Robert Conquest, for example.
But Conquest doesn't he has a figure of 20 million. That's Conquest's figure.
No, I'm talking about his book on the man-made famine.
Yes, I know. It's
Sorrow
called
something. What was the name?
Sorrow of Pity. No.
Harvest of Sorrow.
Harvest of Sorrow. Yes, I know the book. Yes, I read that. Yeah.
So he gives plenty of evidence there. He is not alone. That this thing was intentional. It was no accident. That the Soviet authority knew what they are doing and they intended to do it. Besides, they were not only taking the grain away, they were intentionally killing animals, which meat was never exported or used in any way. They eventually went as far as to kill birds and other animals in the vicinity, so that the peasants may die quicker, because they were not dying quick enough. And they were eventually eating rats and everything. So the authorities were making sure that even small animals that could be killed in the vicinity will be killed, so that the people may die. So it was intentional. 7 million people were intentionally starved to death.
Well, I have respect for Robert Conquest, who's now dead. His greatest book is called The Great Terror.
And his figures, though, are much lower than Rommel's. My point is only that even among specialists, there's some great debate.
He wrote it much earlier.
But he then revised it and came out with an edition after the Soviet archives, in which basically he made the point that the Soviet records, he said, confirmed what he had already written and already written in the first edition of the Great Conquest.
But much of the information cannot be found in any archives. For example, you cannot find any numbers in the archives about these 7 million Ukrainians who were starved to death in 1933.
No, that's true.
There was no order like starved to death all the Ukrainians, or how many Ukrainians have died of war. Right. Actually, they lied in many of these documents. They were using other words, not starvation, but dystrophy and other terms to hide the fact. So you cannot expect to find credible information in the Soviet archives, in this case, as with many other cases.
Okay. Well, I'm only saying that there is some considerable disagreement among even historians and scholars who I respect about how great the numbers are. I'm not saying it because I want the numbers to be smaller. I just want it to be as accurate as possible. But anyway, I mean, what we can agree is the unbelievable scale of privation and death and oppression of the Soviet regime. That's very clear. But and again, the way in which the whole Soviet experiment and especially not just today, but even more so in the Second World War, is still part of a kind of national myth making in the United States that people do not are not made aware of, and that's. I'm just going back to a point I made earlier: the tremendous gap between the discussion you and I are having and the gap between what almost all specialists who look into this subject knows and what the popular media presentation of 20th century is, on the other hand.
Well, this seems to prove my point that no amount of evidence is ever enough.
Well,
the evidence, at the end of the day, the evidence is irrelevant. And this comes from a former lawyer, by the way. I've seen this in the courtrooms. I've seen this reading history books. I've seen this everywhere. The evidence doesn't seem to matter, even in the history of science, as, for example, Kuhn made the case in the 60s, writing the structure of the scientific revolutions. He made the case that even in science, the evidence doesn't matter.
Well, I'm getting back to a point I made earlier, and that is the arrogance or hubris of people who think they are not only smarter, more educated, more enlightened than their parents and grandparents, but also morally superior. This is a very, very popular view among the intellectual class in America. I've seen this in the history profession particularly. For example, there's this very popular educational project called the 1619 Project, promoted by the New York Times, about racial history in America. And it dates the beginning of American history not to 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was made, but to the date when the first slaves landed in Virginia. This is a very bizarre, artificial way of dating history and of recording history. It's history of
It's history the way George Orwell described history.
I call it victimization history.
Yes.
If a people can say that they've been victimized, it gives them a kind of moral superiority.
Yes, George Orwell comes to mind. Whoever controls the present controls the past. Whoever controls the past controls the future.
Well, I'm making a more specific point about in America today. A group will say, oh, you've got to give us special attention and privileges because the group I'm part of, whether they're homosexuals or Jews or blacks or whatever, have been exploited or oppressed in the past. Because those people have been exploited in the past, that gives me a moral superiority.
This is exactly how things were under socialism.
Well, this is a very, but I'm making a point.
I was raised in this atmosphere. Only the victims at the time were sometimes, by the way, it was black people. The victims, we were told that black people are oppressed by the capitalists, but the usual victim were the poor.
Yes, and the working class.
The working class people, but it went through like when you read a history book on the socialism, it's always about the poor being oppressed by the rich.
Yes, right.
It starts from prehistory and it goes to the present day.
Right. Well, in fact, the Communist Manifesto begins with the words, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle." It's not true. It's demonstrably false. But this is the central historical narrative of Marxists and of leftists, that history is this struggle between oppressed and oppressor. That's not really accurate at all, but I'm going back to the bigger point of the hubris in and delusional view about history that's in the intellectual class in America and Western Europe today. I saw this a lot when I was in Europe. I was especially interested in this when I was a student in the University of Munich. The most popular student organization at the University of Munich and at most German universities was what they call the MSB Spartacus. It was the Marxist Student League Spartacus, was affiliated with the Communist Party.
If it's called Spartacus, you could safely assume it's a common organization.
Very communist thing. It was an affiliate of the German.
Spartacus was one of our heroes in the People's Republic.
Right, of course. And I went to many meetings of leftists and of communists, and it's very impressive. In Germany, they're very organized, and they sing these great songs, and it's very organized, and they had people passing out flyers and magazines all over the place, and it was very appealing. But I was very fascinated by the debate that people had in Germany about this issue. There was one class I had on democracy taught by a German professor named Kurt Sontheimer, who's considered an international expert on democracy and the history of democracy. And I remember the essential argument of people in the class among students was between Marxists and non-Marxists. And the Marxists would say, we all believe in democracy. You believe and we believe in democracy in political life, but we also believe in democracy in economic life. Just as the principle of equality in political life is one that's right, so also should we have equality in economic life. And the people who opposed the Marxists had difficulty trying to say and trying to explain why there should be equal political power for everyone in political life, but not equal power and influence for everyone in economic life. Because once you grant that premise of equality of both responsibility and authority, then it's an easy step to say that same principle should be applied in economic life as well. Anyway, that was a big point that was made when I was an interesting, very, very sort of robust debate that was taking place at the University of Munich. And in fact, at one point, there was an attempt to shut down the university, not by the communists, but by the Maoist communists, who were a minority of the communists, but they didn't really succeed. Anyway, all of that, I was very fascinated, you see, by this ferment of different ideologies, different views, different political opinions, and so forth when I was in Germany.
I see nothing fascinating in any of this. First of all, because it's familiar to me, and because I see it for what it was. It was just an excuse to loot somebody else's property. That is the basic of Marxism: is how to rob a bank and feel righteous about it.
Well, the people who are students aren't doing it because there's a high level of idealism for many of these people. They're idealistic.
Yes, they're the useful idiots. I realize that.
Okay.
But without the useful idiots, you will never have the likes of Lenin and Stalin and Hitler coming to power. It's always the useful idiots that make it possible. Or the useful idiots, I dare say, like my grandmother or like my grandfather, who were never part of the totalitarian machine, but they what's the English expression? They opened the road to it. They enable.
They're enablers.
They made it ideologically acceptable to the population of the pre-socialist Bulgaria, to the Kingdom of Bulgaria, which was a capitalist country by and large.
Yeah.
They were the friendly. They were the. I'm looking for a comparison that would be understood by the Westerners. Like they were like the Sinn Féin of the Irish Republican Army.
Okay.
The friendly face, the PR poster boys of the terrorists. And so are these idealists in the West. They just don't know it. But they don't. But here's the thing: they don't care to know it, because if they know it, it will ruin their mood. They want to feel good. They want to be part of the party.
Right.
And you cannot be part of the party and not believe in that what you are doing is bad. Humans are extremely good at deluding themselves, at finding excuses, at finding ways to convince themselves that they're good people. And by and large, people all over the world, even the worst people, the mass murderers, the criminals, even they're convinced that they're moral people.
Right.
They take the Robin Hood myth. Robin Hood supposedly was a good person because he gave to the poor. And guess who adopted this Robin Hood myth? One of the drug kingpins in Latin America. What was his name? One of the biggest.
I don't know. Well, okay.
He was called Robin Hood or something because he was opening kitchens for the poor in Medellin. This Colombian drug lord. What was his name?
Well, I don't remember.
I'm sorry, I forgot his name.
Okay, well, I have to sign off here. I've got some things I've got to do, but I enjoyed our conversation and our discussion.
So did I.
Okay.
Thank you for time well spent.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you later.